Hey, it's Alex Williams of the New Stack. Welcome to the New Stack Makers, a podcast where we talk about application development, deployment, and management at scale. The KubeCon plus CloudNativeCon conferences gather adopters and technologists to further the education and advancement of cloud-native computing. The vendor-neutral event features domain experts and key maintainers behind popular projects like Kubernetes, Prometheus, Envoy, Core DNS, Containerd, and more. I am so excited about this discussion right now. I am here at KubeCon in San Diego. It's the North America show 2019, and joining me is one of the most recognized people, at least who I see, who are real leaders in this community from an analyst point of view and also a user point of view, because Janakiram MSV is both a analyst, advisor, and architect. He knows the technology perhaps better than anyone, and he can write, and he can tell stories, and he is a contributor to the New Stack, and so it's my honor to have you here, Johnny. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Alex.
Johnny has a group called Janakiram and Associates, and you do a webinar. And what's the webinar that you do?
Machine Intelligence on Modern Infrastructure, MI2.
And you also write for Forbes?
Forbes.
Right. So Johnny is top notch. And so we asked Johnny to join us because this discussion is pretty much based upon a one-question survey we did. Very scientific. And people came up with some interesting concerns, and topping the list were issues around administration of Kubernetes and in terms of just developer happiness, developer experience. So Johnny has a few topics that he'd like to discuss. Perhaps what you could do is just tell us what those topics are. You know I want to talk about multitenancy. We'll do that at the very end. But what are these topics that you think really need to be addressed that we can discuss, and then we can go into each one of them.
Absolutely. So I want to discuss the lack of platform flavor of Kubernetes. Mm-hmm. Kubernetes is considered to be infrastructure, and it is still the foundational infrastructure for modern applications. But it lacks the context of an application, and that is one of the biggest drawbacks for developers embracing Kubernetes. So I want to touch upon that.
Okay.
The second one is how Kubernetes blurs the line between developers and admins, and how it has become one layer where everyone is collaborating, which is very good, but at the same time, it is very hard for each of these personas to deal with this beast called Kubernetes.
Yes.
And what does it really mean to individual personas is what I want to discuss. Third thing is some of the upcoming technologies and evolutions of applying policies, enforcing security policies, and making Kubernetes the enterprise platform where departments can confidently run their workloads with isolation and stringent policies and sandboxes. How that is actually coming up and what can be done to Kubernetes to make that a reality. And finally, we can touch upon multitenancy and how it is being applied both at the hyperscale level and at the enterprise.
Great. So let's get into that first topic about the context you're discussing.
Sure. So as we know, Kubernetes has evolved from being a hyperscale orchestration engine to running modern line of business applications. But in that process, what is not coming out very, very clearly is the platform nature of Kubernetes. So if you consider the evolution of infrastructure and platforms, there are two mutually exclusive layers. For example, you have VMs that are offered as infrastructure as a service, whether you take EC2 or Google Compute Engine or Azure VMs. And then there is a layer on top of that that abstracts away the complexity of dealing with VMs, and that is platform as a service. Whether it is Beanstalk from Amazon or Azure App Services or Google App Engine, it actually subsumes the infrastructure but exposes a developer-friendly layer where you can bring source code and walk away with a URL that is readily available to end users. That layer is missing from Kubernetes. So Kubernetes is still pretty much an infrastructure, and there is no developer experience and user experience offered to the consumers of Kubernetes. So Kubernetes, right from day zero, has been predominantly addressing the persona of a cluster administrator, a cluster bootstrapper, and a sysadmin.
Which makes sense, doesn't it, coming out of Google?
Exactly. But today it has graduated from being an infrastructure layer to becoming an all-encompassing platform. But the key layer at the top of infrastructure is sorely missing. That is the biggest challenge. But the good
What's
news.
missing in that what's missing? I mean, there's a missing platform, but what are some of the missing things that are really most recognized in your
Right.
view?
So if I'm a developer, I care about running my application at scale reliably. But today, if you look at the journey from a developer's perspective till he goes live on Kubernetes, there are multiple milestones that he has to go through. All the way from taking source code, packaging that as a Docker image, then packaging the Docker image into a YAML file, and then deploying that YAML file. And an application translates to a series of objects inside Kubernetes. It is not just one application, but it is a set of services. And that kind of takes away from a very consistent developer experience. And that is what I mean by the platform layer. What platforms promise is very simple. You come with your source code, bring your source code, and walk away with a URL that you can publish to your end user. And between these two touch points,
Right.
there are a lot of things that go within Kubernetes, and that is all transparent. It is all available to developers. While it is very transparent and good, it's not a black box, it's also overwhelming for developers because I have to understand the nitty-gritties of config maps, secrets, persistent volumes, network policies, whatnot, before I could actually publish my URL to the end user.
That's a real learning curve.
Exactly. That is because of the lack of platform layer on top of Kubernetes infrastructure.
So to be able to package and bundle those capabilities,
Right.
we are starting to see vendors trying to do that though.
Exactly. So I think a lot of credit goes to Red Hat. Now, Red Hat sensed this at the very beginning, and they created an application lifecycle management layer on top of Kubernetes. And that's the reason why OpenShift is very popular among enterprises. And they were the first to address the developer experience part. But OpenShift is very different. It is packaged and sold from Red Hat. But if you look at the open source world and if you look at what others are doing, I want to call out two efforts. The first one is what Google has been doing with Knative. So Knative is the first attempt to bring in a platform capability to Kubernetes. So Knative has two building blocks. One is serverless eventing. The other one is Knative serving, which is basically the promise of PaaS. More on Knative a little later, but the other effort that I want to call out is what Alibaba and Microsoft have been attempting. That is the open application model and the implementation of open application model called Rudder, which is an implementation from Microsoft, and the other project that Microsoft has been investing called Dapper. So whether it is Knative or OOM, they squarely address the developer experience because the concept of an application in Kubernetes is very loosely defined. So if you take a simple two-tier application, like you have a MongoDB database and you have a Node.js frontend, and you need to go live on Kubernetes, these two layers translate to a dozen objects within Kubernetes. MongoDB needs to be a deployment or a stateful set. It needs to talk to a persistent volume claim. Persistent volume claim talks to, or rather is based on a persistent volume. And then the username and password that is used with MongoDB is stored as a secret that the frontend has to pick up. Then your Node.js application itself is based on a deployment that has replica sets, and replica set has pods. So if you dissect this simple two-component application, it translates to a dozen Kubernetes objects. And the moment you deploy an app in Kubernetes, the context of an app is completely lost. It translates to a bunch of objects and resources, and there is no logical boundary that brings all of them together.
Doesn't that bring us to the second topic then too, in terms of the configuration issue?
Exactly. So that is the next thing. the lack of application context and lack of application awareness, and it's actually hurting everyone in the value chain.
And this is when we see the mix of both developers and IT in the same plane.
Exactly.
And this is where the confusion begins. We start to see this confusion,
Right.
which relates to the context in many ways.
Right. So Kubernetes is a lot like the elephant and the blind man.
Oh, I want to hear this.
So when blind men look at the elephant, someone will look at the tail, someone will look at the
Yes.
trunk, and it's a big beast, but no one knows, how the elephant is actually going to look like. It's so massive, right? So when developers deal with Kubernetes, they see through a different lens. When administrators deal with Kubernetes, they look at it from a different lens. And then you have DevOps, DevSecOps, network administrators, storage administrators, platform administrators, all of them are using the same layer. But there is no clear demarcation on how they are going to deal with this beast called Kubernetes. And that's where the major challenge exists.
Yeah, so we hear this in our conversations. We're starting to hear more about how there is a confusion about who actually does the configuration.
Right, right. So I want to call out what the open application model is advocating and proposing. So eventually, what we're going to end up seeing in Kubernetes is three different roles. The first role is a developer. So the developer only worries about how do I write an application and make it work? How do I basically package my application and drop it in Kubernetes and don't worry about anything else? So that is the first role. And maybe the developer's role ends by packaging a Docker image, testing it on his local environment, and saying, here is a deployable unit, go ahead and run it in production. That's where the developer's role ends. Then the configuration manager's role comes in, and what he does is he assembles these individual Docker images together. He makes them discoverable. He'll apply some configuration settings. He will glue all of them together. He will stitch these components together, and the configuration manager's job ends with that. Then actually comes in the SRE's job, where he is ensuring that it is reliable and it is always available. So in terms of what Alibaba and Microsoft are advocating, this maps to the OOM model really well. So the first one is components. In OOM, developers think in terms of components.
And OOM is?
Open application model.
Okay.
So developers will think in terms of components. So I have a web component, I have a database component, I have an API component. So a component is one or more Docker images. So that is where the developers will deal with. Then the configuration is all about environment variables, config maps, secrets, and how do we stitch these components together to make it a logical application. Then comes in the traits of an application, the third one, which is more aligned with the SRE. So now that I have a fully configured application, how do I make it scalable? How do I make it available? How do I make it durable? How do I make it reliable? And those are all runtime traits. So there you apply the horizontal pod autoscale, cluster autoscale, live probes, health monitoring, logging, tracing, observability, all of that comes in the traits part of it, because that's where you actually take it to the production. So Google is also moving towards the same with Knative serving. There is a lot of similarity on how Google is thinking in expanding the experience. And Cloud Run is one of the developer layers on top of Knative serving.
Right.
And Cloud Run promises the PaaS-like experience to developers. You bring in a Docker image and you walk away with a URL. You don't need to worry about how they're all stitched together by Kubernetes at runtime.
But Knative is such a big project, isn't it? And do you expect there'll be bits and pieces that'll be pulled out of Knative to accomplish this?
The way I visualize this whole thing with Kubernetes, Knative, and Cloud Run. So Kubernetes is the infrastructure. In the traditional world, think of that as a set of bare metal machines or VMs.
Right.
Knative is the platform component.
Right.
It is a meta platform that a lot of vendors can build the next layer, which is the developer experience layer. And Google has built Cloud Run as a developer experience layer. So Cloud Run is developer experience, Knative is the platform, Kubernetes is the infrastructure.
So now let's move into the third topic. And remind me again, we've talked about the context of Kubernetes and what's missing there. We talked about the roles and responsibilities and the delineation in terms of the personas that you mentioned here, both developers, configuration experts, and then the SREs. What's this other big issue that you see?
The other big issue is the lack of isolation of workloads within Kubernetes. That borderlines with multi-tenancy, but I wouldn't go so far. But when Kubernetes project started, namespaces were the logical boundaries. So in Kubernetes, it is very easy to create a namespace and deploy all relevant objects within that namespace. But beyond that, the namespace doesn't serve as the strict boundary between applications. Okay. For example, you cannot really say, this is a sensitive application coming from a finance department, and the pods and services running inside this namespace are inaccessible to any other pods or services outside of this namespace. Applying that policy is very hard. That's where we have projects like Project Calico that is bringing in such policies, but out of the box, this is not imposed. So technically, in a large cluster, anything that you deploy is open to the world, or at least to the organization and rest of the workloads running in the cluster. And that is where there is a big challenge. So isolating workloads and treating them as units of deployment is a critical need for enterprises to adopt Kubernetes.
Okay, so the isolation issue, where does this issue run into developers and and the other parties who are building out Kubernetes architecture?
So it doesn't concern so much to developers. It's not of a big concern because developers don't know where their code will end up running at production. But this hurts more of enterprise administrators and policy makers. So with compliance becoming very important, the lack of control and lack of well-defined boundary is going to hurt more of business administrators and cluster administrators and enterprise IT who would want to have very stringent policies imposed on their workloads, not so much to developers.
So in the meantime, these issues are getting resolved. We are seeing more service providers offering managed Kubernetes environments. Mirantis came out with theirs today, and they, as we well know, they just bought the Docker Enterprise business. There's others, Platform 9 has a popular environment. We have Nirmata out there. We have Google, right, and Microsoft, AWS. The multi-tenancy issue is one that people cited as one of the top concerns. But in your view, it's still an issue that's a little bit further out as a concern.
Right.
And is that because you see the adoption of these service providers just still starting to ramp up?
So how multi-tenancy is done by hyperscale providers is
maybe we could talk about multi-tenancy too, what it is.
Right. So today, multi-tenancy is pretty much the secret sauce of hyperscale providers. For example, when you spin up a cluster on GKE, you don't know how Google manages the control plane and how the master nodes are being provisioned. You don't really know about that. You get a kubectl, you point it to your cluster and it just works, but you wouldn't care so much whether the master nodes and the control plane is being shared or dedicated to your cluster. And going by the economies, I think most of the hyperscale providers will reuse a lot of their investment in the control plane and master, but that is fairly a black box. No one talks about how it is being done. Now, when you switch to the enterprise, remember this term called shadow IT?
Oh, yeah.
In the beginning, in the early days of cloud. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Now it's components and using Kubernetes in different ways.
Yeah. Exactly. So in the early days of cloud, departments and enthusiastic developers went ahead, spun off VMs, ran code, and demonstrated to the management that they're actually running it on cloud. And then when cloud became mainstream and it got real attention from the central IT, there was shadow IT lurking everywhere, right? They had to bring all of them into one fold and legitimately run cloud as a business infrastructure. Now, that's exactly what is happening with Kubernetes. Every department is running their own little cluster lurking in the corner, and someone is deploying a cloud native app and they are claiming that they're actually getting onto the modern infrastructure, modern applications. But central IT hasn't really consolidated these small little clusters in their organization into one. And the day that happens, multi-tenancy will become very, very critical. But till then, as long as Kubernetes is confined to individual departments, that is not a big issue. But it is just a matter of time before multi-tenancy shows up as the biggest issue for enterprise adoption.
Well, so I expect maybe late 2020 we'll start hearing a little bit more about it.
Absolutely. And on the same note, I want to call out how this is going to evolve. Now, there are 4 indicators on how this is going to be addressed. The first one is Google Anthos. So if you look at Google Anthos, it's a control plane for all clusters. Whether you run it on GKE or you run it on EKS or on-prem, Anthos will become your single pane of glass. Project Pacific and Tanzu from VMware is one such project. IBM Multi-Cloud Manager plus OpenShift is the third example. The fourth one is more recent, Azure Arc, where you're actually consolidating your infrastructure into one control plane. Now, this is an early indicator of how multi-tenancy will eventually evolve and how multiple clusters will start to federate and become accessible through one control plane. And that is how multi-tenancy will eventually evolve. There is a lot of learning to take from these commercial implementations of Anthos, Arc, and even for that matter, what Rancher is doing with their multi-cloud configuration.
Right, they're another service provider.
Exactly.
Sure, yeah.
So there are a lot of learnings that we can take, and some of them will flow into the SIG that will eventually deal with multi-tenancy.
Mm-hmm. Johnny, it's been a real treat to have a chance to talk with you about the Kubernetes landscape and these top issues that you see out there. And so just in review, we talked about this issue about application context.
Right.
You know, you might be able to generate a URL, but it's a lot of, piecing together to actually bring all these components into one place. And we're still trying to learn that because we don't have that platform as a service capability. Secondly, we have this issue with some confusion, for example, about who does what.
Right.
The developers, you cite 3 personas: the developer,
configuration manager,
and the SRE. The third issue is about isolation.
Right.
And this issue about how it is difficult for an IT manager or maybe it's that configuration manager,
right,
to really to be able to isolate to some extent. I'm not just phrasing it well, but I think what you're basically saying is like the isolation issues can get in the way because namespaces cannot do it all.
Right, exactly.
And then there's a final issue, and we're talking about multi-tenancy, which is still a little bit further out, but it's going to be a big issue because of what you're talking about here in terms of like, how do you think about that control plane?
Right.
And then how do you think about how do you manage multi-tenant environments across the control plane?
Exactly.
Right.
Perfect.
So thank you so much, and have a great show. And we have some more work to do ourselves, the two of us, in terms of some demos we're going to do together.
Absolutely.
And so thanks again, and we'll talk soon.
Thanks, Alex. It's been my pleasure being on the show.
Great.
Thank you.
The KubeCon plus CloudNativeCon conferences gather adopters and technologists to further the education and advancement of cloud-native computing. The vendor-neutral event features domain experts and key maintainers behind popular projects like Kubernetes, Prometheus, Envoy, Core DNS, Containerd, and more. Listen to more episodes of the New Stack Makers at thenewstack.io/podcast. Please rate and review us on iTunes, like us on YouTube, and follow us on SoundCloud. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.